These are my disclosures. The sodium conundrum. A conundrum is a riddle, a brain teaser, an enigma, so I could perfectly be rephrasing the topic of my talk as the riddle of salt. Salt, as you know, consists of less sodium actually than there is chloride because of their difference in molecular weight. And you also are aware of the dietary recommendations of sodium or salt, actually, that we need or we are advised to take in around 2.3 grams of sodium, which equals more or less to 100 millimole per day. On the other hand, you realize that in 1 liter of sodium chloride, 0.9%, there is 9 grams of sodium chloride and already 3.5 grams of sodium. So in 1 liter of this bag, it is already way far more than the dietary recommendation of sodium. This is the new food pyramid that was issued lately by the Flemish Institute for Healthy Living, typically Belgian, so we turned it upside down, and now at the top level there is the most important thing: drink mainly water, and the advice to do it 2 liter, 2.5 liter. On the other hand, in this red circle there, in the middle of the red circle is salt, is sodium. And what they say is you can take more or less 3.2 grams of sodium. So that's actually what they advise, is taking in isotonic solutions, much more water than sodium, 100 millimoles in 2 liters and a half of water. Let's go back to very old physiology. This graph is still in current and actual physiology books, but it actually dates back to an experiment from the 70s. And what did they do? And I think that is the most important slide of my talk. What did they do? They took people, just normal people that were on a very low sodium diet of around 0.5 grams and augmented or increased this dietary intake to 3.2 grams, which is more or less the dietary intake we are advised, or as a maximum these days, from 20 to 150 millimoles. What did happen, and I think Luciano already alluded to it, what did happen is that in a few days the output of sodium was much slower than the intake of sodium, and it took a day or 3, 2, 4, 5 to re-equilibrate. That's no problem, but what was the result? What happened? There was a weight gain of around 1 kilogram, and this weight gain only disappeared after the sodium intake had been reduced again to the normal level of 0.5, to their set point, if you like. The day before yesterday we had a faculty dinner, the day before we had a welcome dinner, yesterday we had a gala dinner. Why don't we look swollen up altogether? This is because we are drinking hypotonic fluids, and it looks like we look still the same. We pee everything out, and at the end of the day, if you don't do it too often, of course, if you do it for many, many years, this party style, then you will eventually get fat, but you look more or less the same after just drinking some beer with a little bit of salty nuts. Our patients, on the other hand, do something else. They experience this sometimes in a very quick way. Of course, I agree this is organ failure. Of course, I agree this is kidney failure. There is capillary leakage. There is hormonal disturbances. But the question right now here of the hypothesis I want to discuss with you is, what is there a problem, or could there be a problem with the fluid itself, with the sodium concentration of fluids we give them? Could there be an issue there? Because not all patients are capillary leaky or hormonal disturbances. Sometimes it's just the quite healthy perioperative patient that gains 2 or 3 kilograms of weight in a very short time. Is it relevant? Yes, we know it is relevant. A weight gain of 2 to 3 kilograms in the perioperative setting has been associated with mortality and delayed recovery for many, many years ago. So the hypothesis here I want to discuss with you today is regarding fluid overload. The problem is not the volume we give, or not only the volume we give, the problem is also the sodium in it, or the salt. We did this experiment here, the mimosa, it's the metabolism of isotonic versus hypertonic maintenance solutions in adult. It was to put maintenance solutions on the map again. And what did we do? We took 12 volunteers, 12 perfectly normal, healthy people, main age 35. They were allowed to be a little bit obese because we are all a little bit, but they had to have a perfectly normal kidney function. eGFR was 110 plus or minus 13. Perfectly normal kidney function. And we asked them to refrain from any oral intake during 2 study periods of 48 hours. And we went in, and the first period, we gave them an isotonic solution, actually a quite hypertonic solution, but it's a solution that we all use, or that many people use for maintenance. It's sodium, it's sodium chloride 0.9%. We added glucose to avoid starvation ketosis, and we added some potassium to meet the recommendations of 1 millimole per kilogram per day of potassium. The other study period was with another solution. It was with a hypertonic solution. We used there a commercially available mix that is here on the Belgian market. It's called Glucion, but the most important thing is there is only 54 millimoles of sodium in it. What we saw at the end of the 48 study periods, we saw that after just treating these perfectly normal people with guideline-recommended dose of maintenance solutions of 25 ml per kilogram per day, what did we see? They retained, or they voided 600 cc's less urine when they were treated with the isotonic solution. From a fluid balance point of view, they retained 600 cc's just after maintenance fluids, after 48 hours of just getting maintenance fluids. You see happening something very strange. There is one guy who was a little bit obese and he was hypertensive at the beginning of the moment. What looked like an exaggerated natriuresis that is sometimes associated with beginning hypertension. He didn't know he had it, we didn't know. So he just peed an enormous load of salt out. When we expulsed him from the analysis, this number of 600 ml fluid balance more was even increased to 800 cc's more. So we do fluid retention even with maintenance solution that is containing quite some salt. What was the physiological explanation behind it? We thought it could have been osmoregulation, hypertonic solution. It turned out it didn't, because antidiuretic hormone was exactly the same, thirst score was exactly the same, serum osmolality was exactly the same. What did happen here was there was a volumetric effect, there was a volume effect. What we measured was aldosterone, and what turned out to be the aldosterone went down in the isotonic period. So I think, or I think I'm right actually, is that isotonic solutions cause a unintentional or an intentional, but mostly unintentional expansion of plasma compartments. We fill up with maintenance solutions that are isotonic. That is not the purpose we give maintenance solutions for. When we take the old experiment from the 70s and we look what we have done, our patients began here. We checked it with urine collections. They had a mean dietary intake of 133. In the isotonic period, they had 267, so it's more or less the same difference. And what happened? Exactly the same. There was a weight gain of around 1 kilo, 800 cc's. The question is, what do we do, of course, if we give our patients much more salt for a much longer time? I think the fluid itself can partially explain all this weight gain, or part of this weight gain. The question is, of course, is this clinically relevant? And yes, there are some data about it. Even now, there are studies being done, but you have to delve deep to find them, that associate not fluid balance, but sodium balance with respiratory dysfunction in mechanically ventilated patients. So maybe there is an issue there. Another question is, or an important question is, why bother? You can't resuscitate patients with hypertonic solutions. You have to give isotonic solutions to fill them up, of course. And I fully agree, of course. But let us look a little bit further. Let us look a little bit beyond resuscitation solutions. Therefore, we looked in the database of the intensive care unit of the University Hospital of Antwerp, 45 bed, and we tend to be very fluid aware, so we decrease maintenance solutions from the moment there is nutrition and feeding. So we queried all sources of fluids given to every patient at every day of the ICU. So we queried 73,000 days of ICU, and these were the results. What are we talking about when we're talking about fluid use in the hospital? We're talking about, we are talking about a very small part is resuscitation fluids, only a few cc's and maybe 7 to 10%. There is a large volume of maintenance solutions, even in this hospital where all doctors are trained to reduce fluids whenever necessary, and what we see otherwise. So there is a big amount of maintenance solutions that you could steer, or that you could see or could decide which tonicity they should have. And secondly, there is an enormous amount of what I call fluid creep, which is all the volume, all the solutions that go into our patients without us prescribing them. The infusion pumps, the medication, the small flasks, all these things are going into patients too, and these medications are very frequently solved in salt and could be solved in glucose 5% if you consult the hospital pharmacists. Next question is a difficult one. Aren't maintenance solutions or are hypotonic maintenance solutions supposed to be dangerous according to pediatric data? And yes, there are some publications lately that advise to give isotonic maintenance solutions to all children of any age. My answer there is, according to adult guidelines and basic physiology, they still should be hypotonic, that's one. And second, are we really sure the pediatricians were right on this one? Let me take you back to the birth of evidence. How is evidence born? Most of the time it is some guy or gal having a problem. For example, we do see lots of hyponatremia in young patients. And then some other guy or gal or researcher gets a brilliant idea. We call it a JABI, just another brilliant idea. And he does a small study, and then most of the time this study is copied and getting bigger and bigger and more data. And then we have an army of people writing meta-analyses and editorials. And before you know, you are at the top of the scientific pyramid, and you have a Cochrane analysis at your hand, and thing has become new evidence. Look at the hyponatremia question in children. Hyponatremia in sick children is frequently encountered, I fully agree. Then came the JABI, just another brilliant idea. This was the reason why there is an increased ADH secretion is pain and stress and nausea. And the solution lies in adapting maintenance strategy or maintenance fluid therapy. And we will change the current practice versus a harmless alternative. I don't agree fully. The reason is an increased ADH. It's not only because of pain and stress and nausea. It's mainly because of undetected occult hypovolemia. And you should treat that by isotonic resuscitation solutions, not by maintenance solutions. So second, current practice versus a harmless alternative. I think my data are relevant in predicting that children can be overfilled if we do this. So it's not so harmless to give them salt. Next, we had a publication, and then you hope to have clear and incontrovertible findings, of course. I don't think they were. Look at the results. Hyponatremia indeed decreased from 11% to around 4%, but severe hyponatremia was in this study of 800 patients seen only in 2 patients in each group. The serum sodium was exactly the same in all groups. The serious adverse events due to solutions were higher in the isotonic group, and seizures, yes, seizures diminished from 2% to 0.3%. So actually what we are talking about here is fluid or salt overloading 98% of children to avoid seizures in 2% of them. We should have the debate about that. I don't say it wrong, but we should have the debate about it. Second step was this. Meta-analysis and editorials. We had an article in the New England Journal of Medicine where these data were extrapolated to adults, and adults are much less prone to hyponatremia, and the disease severity of hyponatremia is also much less, I think. So I think we are using a cannon to kill a fly here by giving all these children and all adults, by extension, high isotonic maintenance solution, which is contrary to basic physiology. The last question is, if we end up with this sodium overload, can we do something about it? We have these patients that are swollen up, as you all know them. Can we do something? And what we do mostly is we give them Lasix, we give them furosemide. Again, a study buried very deep in literature, 86 patients down under in New Zealand and Australia for intensive care units, where they chose to give furosemide, 1 milligram per kilogram, versus furosemide, 1 milligram per kilogram, plus indapamide, and which is also used to desalt these patients. What we saw was no change in fluid balance, but there was a significant change, even after 48 hours, I think, in peripheral edema. How come? Because if we only give Lasix and we only remove water, we will increase tonicity and we will dry out cells because we are sucking out intracellular water. This is the problem with all these studies after the resuscitation, getting cognitive impairment. What do you do if you also remove the salt? Yeah, then you can remove probably the peripheral edema. I think that's a good idea. Second thing is we saw a significant decrease in sodium balance, of course, but we saw less furosemide-induced hypernatremia. Lastly, I don't know how it is explained, but kidney function was better, and icing on the cake, there was a decreased chloride levels. Every intensivist hates these days chloride, I have the impression. So I come to my conclusions, my dear Chairman. Sodium administration higher than normal dietary intake leads to fluid retention that is independent of disease state. It's just the fluid itself. Isotonic fluids are a major source of that, and we could avoid it. Unnecessary sodium sources should be avoided. Maintenance solutions, we have to think more about them. Fluid creep, we have to assess that and see whether we can cut down. And finally, we cannot, of course, lose attention for ADH-induced hyponatremia. I thank you for your attention.